My mother sat me on a church bench when I was 4 years old and said, "Stay here, God will take care of you." She walked away, smiling hand in hand with my sister and father. I couldn't even cry, just watched them go. 20 years later, they walked into the same church and said, "We're your parents. We've come to take you home." The winter sunlight in Boston streamed through the stained glass windows of the church, casting rainbow-colored light on the floor. The Sunday service at St. Margaret's Church had ended, and the parishioners had already gone home. Only a little girl in a red coat remained sitting on the old wooden bench. 4-year-old Grace Hudson looked up at her mother with large brown eyes filled with anxiety. Her mother Elizabeth smiled gently and touched Grace's cheek. "Stay here. God will surely help you." Elizabeth's voice was soft, but there was something strange about it. Grace couldn't put it into words, but she noticed her mother's eyes were a bit shifty. "But, Mama," Grace said in a small voice, "where are you going? When will you come back?" Elizabeth didn't answer. Instead, she took the small hand of Amy, Grace's little sister who had just turned 2. Amy was wearing a pink coat and innocently laughing as her golden curls bounced, seemingly unaware of her sister's anxiety. At the church entrance, Grace's stepfather Joseph was waiting. When Grace saw him, her little heart beat faster. He had never smiled at her. Grace intuitively knew he didn't love her. "Hurry up, Liz." Joseph's voice broke the silence of the church. "Let's go." Elizabeth lightly stroked Grace's hair. "Be a good girl. God will watch over you." Grace felt that something was wrong. Normally, after Sunday service, the whole family would return home together, and Elizabeth would prepare a roast beef dinner. Grace couldn't understand why today was different. "Mama, I want to go home with you." Grace tried to grab her mother's coat sleeve. Elizabeth gently but firmly released her daughter's hand, saying, "Grace, listen to what I say. Stay here and wait." When her mother led Amy by the hand toward the church exit, Grace felt as if her feet had become as heavy as wood, making it impossible for her to move. The light streaming through the windows began to fade, and the interior of the church grew dimmer. At the exit door, Elizabeth turned around. Her face bore an expression that Grace couldn't quite understand. Was it relief? Or was it sadness? Joseph placed his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder, and the three of them went out the door. Grace couldn't make a sound. She wanted to scream, but nothing came out, as if her throat had frozen. She just sat on the bench and heard the sound of the large church door closing. It sounded like her small world collapsing. Time passed slowly. Only the sound of the big church clock's hands moving broke the silence. Grace sat on the bench and waited as her mother had told her to. The outside light gradually began to fade. Eventually, Martha Jenkins, the church caretaker, came in. She had come to clean the floor but was surprised to find a little girl sitting alone. "Oh, my dear, why are you here?" Martha asked kindly. Grace remained silent, still staring at the door. "Mama said she'd come back," she finally said in a small voice. Martha looked around worriedly. "Where is your mama?" "Mama and Papa and Amy left. But they said they'd be back soon." A look of concern crossed Martha's face. She immediately contacted Reverend Thomas. The elderly pastor with warm eyes hurried over and sat next to Grace. "Hello, little miss. What's your name?" "Grace Hudson," she answered softly. Reverend Thomas smiled kindly, but worry was visible in his eyes. "Grace, didn't your mother and father tell you where they were going?" Grace shook her head. "Mama said, God will surely help you." Reverend Thomas and Martha exchanged glances. They called the police. When the officers arrived at the church, they gently questioned Grace. They asked for her parents' names, address, and how long ago they had left. By nightfall, Grace was still sitting on the church bench. Now a female police officer sat beside her, draping a blanket over her small shoulders. The police had gone to her home, but the Hudson family had vanished. Most of the furniture remained, but clothing and personal belongings had been neatly packed away. It appeared to be a planned departure. Grace's brown eyes were moist with tears, but she didn't cry. She believed her mother's words and continued to wait. That God would help her. And indeed, God did not abandon her. That night, Reverend Thomas took her to a small room in the church and provided her with a warm meal and a safe place. He spoke to her. "God has led you here, Grace. And we will take care of you." From that day on, Grace lived in the church. Her parents and sister never returned. This event left a deep wound in her small heart. For the first few weeks, she stood by the window every morning, waiting for her parents and sister to come for her. But as the seasons changed, the snow melted, and spring flowers began to bloom, there was no sign of the Hudson family. Reverend Thomas and his wife Esther welcomed Grace into their home. They had no children of their own, and began legal proceedings to adopt this little girl. The police investigation continued, but no trace of Elizabeth and Joseph Hudson could be found. They had crossed state lines and probably changed their names. Why did they leave me behind? Grace asked herself repeatedly at night, alone in her bed. It was something her young heart couldn't understand. But during the day, she began to find comfort in Reverend Thomas's teachings. God never abandons us, Reverend Thomas told her. Sometimes there are plans beyond our understanding, but the path is always filled with love. At 7, Grace began attending the local elementary school. She was smart and loved reading books. She was particularly fascinated by Bible stories, and identified with characters like Moses, Joseph, and David who overcame hardships. Because she herself had been abandoned, these stories resonated deeply with her. Grace's school life was ordinary. She had friends but rarely formed deep bonds. She always kept a bit of distance. She was afraid of trusting someone and being betrayed again. But at church, it was different. In Sunday school she was lively and enthusiastically taught Bible stories to younger children. On her 12th birthday, Reverend Thomas gave her a special Bible. "You have a special gift, Grace," he said. "Your words have the power to move people's hearts." Around that time, Grace began keeping a journal. She wrote about her thoughts and faith. Sometimes she wrote something like letters to Amy. What kind of child would Amy be now? Would she like Bible stories too? Grace became a notable presence at school. She won debate competitions and became a leader in the church youth group. People always gathered around her, listening to her words and ideas. But sometimes at night, she was haunted by nightmares. In those dreams, her mother's smiling face and the image of her family walking away from the church appeared repeatedly. "Why don't I have a family?" 16-year-old Grace asked her adoptive parents Thomas and Esther one night. Esther embraced her. "You do have a family. It's us. And you're also a member of God's family. But my real parents," Reverend Thomas took her hand. "They made a mistake. But that mistake led you to us. God brings good out of bad situations." Grace was comforted by these words. She learned to accept her past and look toward the future. After high school graduation, she entered the theology department at Boston University. Her goal was clear. She wanted to work helping people who were suffering, especially abandoned children. Grace shone during her college years. She was intelligent and passionate, highly regarded by her professors. She hosted Bible study groups and volunteered at a local orphanage. "You bring light to these children's hearts," the orphanage director told her. But there was always a small void in Grace's heart. Occasionally, she thought about the parents who had abandoned her. Where were they now? Was Amy doing well? Could she forgive them? When Grace was 23, her beloved adoptive father, Reverend Thomas, suffered a stroke. He recovered, but his health was not good afterward. Grace graduated from graduate school and immediately began working as a youth pastor at St. Margaret's Church. She trained under her adoptive father, honing her preaching skills. "Your words have a special power," Reverend Thomas told her. "It's a gift from God. Use it wisely." At 27, Grace's life reached a major turning point. Reverend Thomas passed away peacefully. Esther grieved but rejoiced that her husband had gone to heaven. Hundreds of people gathered at the funeral to honor his life. On the night of the funeral, Grace sat alone in the church sanctuary. On the same bench where, 23 years earlier, she had been abandoned by her mother at the age of 4. She prayed quietly, "God, what should I do?" At that moment, she felt as if she had received a clear vision. She realized what her mission was. The next morning, Grace told Esther her plan. "I'm going to start a new church. I'll call it Church of the Light of Hope. It will be a place for people who have been abandoned, for people who are hurt." Esther supported her decision. "Thomas would be proud of you." Grace rented a small warehouse and began her first service. At first, it was a gathering of about 20 people, but gradually, people were drawn to her passionate preaching and warm hospitality. Her message was simple: you are never alone. No matter how deep the darkness, the light of hope is always guiding you. Grace's church grew rapidly. 3 years later, they moved to a larger building, and 5 years after that, it became an organization with branches across the United States. Her sermons were broadcast on television, and her book, Hope for the Abandoned, became a bestseller. At 34, Grace had become one of the most influential religious leaders in America. Though successful on the surface, Grace always had a small wound deep in her heart. She had never publicly shared her past. Her profile simply stated that she was the adopted daughter of Reverend Thomas and Esther Smith. She had transformed that wound into a power to heal others. Esther watched over her success and was always supportive. "You are fulfilling a special mission," she told Grace. "The day Thomas and I found you was part of God's plan." Grace believed this. She had overcome the pain of her past and transformed it into a power to help many people. Because she knew the pain of being abandoned, she had words that could reach the hearts of people with the same pain. The large sanctuary of the Church of the Light of Hope was always overflowing with people on Sunday mornings. This day was no exception, with more than 2,000 believers gathered, eagerly awaiting Grace Hudson's sermon. On the walls of the sanctuary, the words "Let there be light for the abandoned" were prominently displayed. That was the core of Grace's teaching and her own life philosophy. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Grace's voice was soft yet resonated throughout the sanctuary. She was now 34, but her face had a youthfulness, and, at the same time, the deep wisdom of an old soul. Her long chestnut hair curled elegantly at her shoulders, and her deep brown eyes reflected both warmth and strength. Grace's sermons always focused on acceptance and healing, but on this day, there was a special resonance in her voice, as if something within her was being stirred. In life, there are sometimes partings we cannot understand. When loved ones leave, we ask why. But sometimes those partings bring new encounters. Grace slowly descended from the pulpit and began walking among the congregation. She always preferred to speak at the same eye level as her audience. "I tell you all, don't be trapped by the pain of the past. Overcome it, and find a new light. If someone has abandoned you, perhaps God is showing you a new path." Her words resonated with many people's hearts. Some wept, some nodded, some offered prayers. Grace's sermons had a mysterious power to move people. It wasn't just eloquence, but the power of truth born from her own experience. When the sermon ended, the congregation stood and applauded. Her message had touched many hearts. The words of her adoptive father, Reverend Thomas, came back to her. "God brings good out of bad situations." Grace smiled toward Amy. Her life had traced a strange circle. The girl abandoned in a church had now become someone who gave hope to many people, and found a new bond with her long-lost sister. The words she had heard on that church bench when she was 4 years old had, in the end, proven true. "God will surely help you." Those words had been realized in ways she could never have imagined. After the service ended, and believers began heading home one after another, Grace exchanged words with many people. Those seeking encouragement, those seeking advice, those simply wanting to express gratitude. She sincerely addressed each one. Mary Johnson, Grace's secretary who had been a supporter since Grace started her church, approached her. "There are visitors who would like to see you." Grace smiled. "Many people come on Sundays. Who is it?" Mary showed a slightly confused expression. "They say they are special visitors. Family, they say." Grace's smile froze. "Family? Yes. They said their names are Hudson, Elizabeth and Joseph Hudson, and their daughter Amy." Grace's heart began to beat rapidly. In her mind, memories she had long sealed away suddenly resurfaced. The red coat, the church bench, her mother's last words. "God will surely help you." "Where are they?" Her voice trembled. "I've shown them to the small conference room. Would you like to meet them?" Grace took a deep breath. The people who had abandoned her nearly 30 years ago were now here. Why now? Why here? Various emotions swirled within her. Anger, fear, curiosity, and a strange sense of anticipation. "Yes, I'll meet them," she finally answered. The short hallway to the small conference room felt like an eternity to Grace. She walked toward the door listening to her own heartbeat. She clearly remembered that day nearly 30 years ago. The moment when, at 4 years old, she was sat on a church bench by her mother and told, "God will surely help you." When she opened the door, 3 people were standing there. A couple in their mid-60s and a woman in her 30s. Grace's eyes first went to the older woman. Elizabeth, her mother. There were remnants of her former beauty, but now her face was lined with wrinkles, and her hair had turned white, but her blue eyes remained unchanged. "Grace, it's really you." Elizabeth's voice trembled with emotion. Grace couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at the people in front of her. Next to her was a tall man. Joseph. He too had aged, and his former dignity had receded, but the line of his jaw and the shape of his eyes remained the same. And Amy, the sister who was just 2 years old when Grace last saw her, was now a beautiful grown woman. She was looking at Grace with a composed expression, but there was something in her eyes. Guilt? Anxiety? "We're your family," Elizabeth stepped forward. "We've come to take you home." The moment she heard those words, something snapped in Grace's mind. A flash of memory. 4-year-old Grace sitting on the church bench, hearing her mother's words. "Stay here. God will surely help you," and the sound of the door closing. Waiting. Hours, days, years of waiting. "You're my mother." Grace's voice trembled. For the past 30 years, she had imagined this moment many times. Sometimes with anger, sometimes seeking forgiveness, sometimes simply trying to understand. But reality was completely different from her imagination. "Yes, we've finally found you." Elizabeth's face showed an expression of joy. She tried to approach Grace, but Grace unconsciously took a step back. "Let's go home," Joseph said. His voice did not have the coldness that Grace remembered. Instead, there was a strange familiarity in it. "We've been looking for you all this time." Grace was at a loss for words. She couldn't tell if this was reality or an extension of her nightmares. What she had unconsciously been searching for was a mother's love, family bonds. But standing before her now were the people who had abandoned her. Amy remained silent. She stared intently at Grace, wearing a complex expression, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. "Why?" Grace finally squeezed out the words. "Why now?" Elizabeth, without losing her smile, answered, "It took time to find you. But when I saw you on television, I knew immediately that you were my daughter. 30 years." Grace's voice was quiet but contained strong anger. "For 30 years you didn't look for me." "That's not true," Joseph interjected. "There were circumstances. We'll explain everything. Just, not here. Could we talk somewhere more private?" Grace took a deep breath. Her head was in turmoil. "All right," she finally said. "Let's talk at my home." As she headed for the door, Amy spoke for the first time. "Grace, sister." Hearing those words, Grace stopped. The relationship she had always dreamed of. But now, those words evoked complex emotions. "I'm glad to meet you." Amy's voice was small, but sincerity could be felt. Grace stared back at her. In Amy's eyes she saw something like a warning. Or was it her imagination? "Let's go," Grace said. Her voice was surprisingly calm, but her heart was raging like a storm. Grace's home was in a quiet residential area, about a 15-minute drive from the Church of the Light of Hope. It wasn't a large mansion, but it was an elegant and warm home. When they entered, the living room was decorated with framed Bible verses and small mementos collected from churches around the world. "Please, have a seat," Grace said, maintaining her composure. She appeared calm on the surface, but emotions were swirling inside her. Elizabeth and Joseph sat on the sofa, while Amy sat in a single chair a little distance away. Their eyes wandered around the room, seemingly trying to glimpse a part of Grace's life. "Lovely home," Elizabeth said. "You've been successful." Grace sat in a chair opposite them and answered, choosing her words carefully. "It's thanks to God's guidance." An awkward silence flowed. Where should they begin to fill a 30-year gap? Grace suppressed her emotions and asked in a tone as if approaching a business meeting, "Why did you come looking for me now?" Elizabeth and Joseph exchanged glances. Elizabeth opened her mouth. "We've been looking for you all along. When we returned to the church that day, you were gone." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Returned? Didn't you leave me behind?" "No," Elizabeth emotionally denied. "It was a sad misunderstanding. We had to take Amy to the hospital urgently. She suddenly developed a high fever. I'm sure I told you, wait here, we'll be right back." Grace traced the memory in her head. Her mother's words were, "God will surely help you." Nothing was said about the hospital. And when we came back, you were gone, Joseph continued. We reported it to the police, but no one could find you. Grace calmly said, the police did find me. They also visited your home. But you had moved. All personal belongings had been packed away. Elizabeth's face changed color. That's well. We were in financial trouble, Joseph quickly said. We had to flee from creditors. But we've been looking for you all along. Grace felt something was off about their story. There were too many contradictions. For 30 years? She quietly asked. Why didn't you contact me until you saw me on television? We had changed our names, Elizabeth hastily explained. It was difficult to find you. Amy remained silent, looking out the window. There was something odd about her attitude, as if she didn't want to participate in this conversation. Grace stepped into the kitchen momentarily to get cold drinks. While taking lemonade from the refrigerator, she took a deep breath. Many questions were swirling in her head. Was their story true? If it was a lie, why had they come looking for her now? When she returned to the living room, Elizabeth and Joseph were discussing something in low voices. As she approached, the two suddenly stopped their conversation. Here's some lemonade. Grace placed the tray down. Thank you, dear. Elizabeth's voice suddenly contained familiarity. Your church is truly wonderful. You have thousands of followers. Yes, Grace answered. We have branches across the country. Quite a success, Joseph said. There was a calculating light in his eyes. You must be financially blessed as well. At that moment, doubt intensified in Grace's heart. Was their interest not in her herself, but in her success? May I use your bathroom? Amy spoke up for the first time. Down the hall to the left, Grace answered. As Amy stood up, Elizabeth continued talking. We can be together as a family again. We need you, Grace. As Amy left the living room, Grace listened to her footsteps heading toward the bathroom. However, the footsteps stopped midway and then headed toward her private room. Grace stood up saying, "Excuse me for a moment," and followed Amy. When she opened the door to her study, Amy was standing in front of her desk. What are you doing? Grace asked. Amy turned around and looked at her with serious eyes. I need to talk to you. Just the two of us. Grace, though confused, closed the door. About what? Don't believe what they say? Amy's voice was low and urgent. They abandoned you. Intentionally. Grace's heart began to race. What do you mean? They're after your fame and money, Amy said hastily. Your mother's child from her previous husband, so father always disliked you. Grace gasped. Previous husband? Yes. Mother was widowed from her first husband and remarried Joseph when you were 2. He wasn't keen on raising you as his own child. When I was born, they planned to leave you at the church. Grace almost collapsed into a chair. This was a completely different truth from what she had thought all her life. She wasn't her stepfather's biological child. How do you know? She finally managed to say. I've always wanted to know about my sister. Tears welled up in Amy's eyes. Since I was little, I've heard mother and father say they abandoned my sister. At first, they said you were adopted, but later they told me the truth. Amy continued. I've lived with guilt, thinking you were abandoned because I was born. Grace was at a loss for words. In her mind, pieces of the past were coming together one by one. They started looking for you a year ago, Amy continued in a low voice. When they saw you on television, they thought they could make money. They're in debt, and thought if they claimed to be your daughter, they could get something. Rather than anger, Grace felt a strange sense of liberation. Finally, there was an answer to years of questions. Why are you telling me this? Grace asked. Amy's eyes held sincere emotion. Because I don't want to be part of their plan. And she choked on her words. I wanted to meet you. As a real sister. There was a knock at the door. Everything all right? Came Elizabeth's voice. What are you talking about? Grace and Amy looked at each other. An unspoken understanding was born between them. We're fine, Mother, Amy answered. Just talking with my sister. Grace took a deep breath. She now knew the truth. She had choices before her. To give in to anger, or to handle this situation wisely. Let's go back, she said quietly to Amy. I have something to tell them. When the two left the study, Elizabeth and Joseph were standing uneasily in the living room. Their faces showed a mixture of doubt and expectation. Grace calmly said, "Please sit down. We need to talk." Her voice contained a certainty and strength that hadn't been there before. She was ready to accept her past and walk toward the future. "Your plan to exploit me financially has failed." Grace's voice was quiet, but her words contained a sharp edge. The blood visibly drained from Elizabeth and Joseph's faces. "What are you saying?" Elizabeth tried to feign innocence, but her eyes couldn't hide her fear. "Amy told me the truth," Grace said. "You abandoned me. Intentionally. And now? You're trying to benefit from my success." "Amy." Joseph showed his anger. "What did you say?" Though trembling, Amy stood beside her sister. "Let's stop the lies. I owe Grace the truth." Grace quietly said to them, "I could sue you for attempted fraud, but I won't." Elizabeth and Joseph showed surprised expressions. They had probably expected an explosion of anger or threats of legal action. "Why?" Joseph asked suspiciously. "My teaching is about forgiveness and healing," Grace answered. "I must practice it myself. But this is your final warning. Don't ever appear before me again." Elizabeth began to cry. Grace didn't know if they were real tears or acting. But it no longer mattered. She was free from her past. "Please, leave." Grace pointed to the door. Elizabeth and Joseph, without the strength to resist any further, silently stood up. Grace calmly watched them leave her home. Amy hesitated a little, then approached Grace. "Should I go too?" Her voice was filled with anxiety. Grace looked at her. In Amy's eyes, she saw genuine regret and hope. "That's your choice. I want to build a relationship with you," Amy said, "as sisters. But if you need time, I understand." Grace nodded gently. "It will take time, but let's stay in touch." 3 months later, Grace began a new sermon series, "What is True Family?" For the first time, she publicly shared her experience. Being left at a church at 4 years old, being raised by Reverend Thomas and his wife, and the roots she had recently discovered. Family is not just about blood ties, she addressed the congregation. Family is the people who support each other, love each other, and sometimes tell each other hard truths. At the back of the venue was Amy. She had now begun working as a volunteer at the Church of the Light of Hope. Their relationship was complex, but they were gradually building a sisterly bond. When Grace finished her sermon, the congregation stood and applauded. Her words had resonated with many people's hearts. The words of her adoptive father, Reverend Thomas, came back to her now. "God brings good out of bad situations." Grace smiled toward Amy. Her life had traced a strange circle. The girl abandoned in a church had now become someone who gave hope to many people and had found a new bond with her long-lost sister. The words she had heard on that church bench when she was 4 years old had, in the end, proven true. "God will surely help you." Those words had been realized in ways she could never have imagined.